I'm Kirsten Saunders, co-founder of Rich and Regular and co-author of Cashing Out, Win the Wealth Game by Walking Away. Welcome to my book review. Reading since I was 3 years old, and that's not just a humble brag. There's a point to this. I'm now 37, and at my big age, there are just way more demands on my time. And so now I'm only reading books that, change my perspective on something or introduce me to a new idea. I'm not really reading things that I already believe in. And so this book that I read, this first book that kicked off my 2022, Quit Like a Woman, literally broke my brain. And I've been looking for ways to share. I'm a big note taker, so I've been looking for ways to share some of the learnings that I get from books with you all. And I knew that this was the first book that I needed to do a book review on. And so that's why we're here today. I want to tell you about my two big takeaways from the book, as well as kind of where I'm going from here. So a little bit about me. In the past 2 years, I have quit my job. I've written a book, I've launched a podcast, I have spoken on stages all across the country, and yet not drinking for 31 days during dry January is the most transformative thing that I've done. And it feels crazy to say that because that list of stuff that I just named is things that I used to dream about. But this book, Quit Like a Woman, is one of the reasons why I had such a transformative experience. That, and I would credit my wisdom. Again, I've been on this earth 37 big years, and I now know what it takes to commit to a goal that challenges you at your core. I'm not someone who identifies as like having an alcohol problem. I wouldn't say that I was an alcoholic, but I absolutely identify as a drinker, right? So if there's wine at dinner, I'm gonna have me a glass. If there's a happy hour, I'm saying yes. If there's a drink, I'm gonna have one. And the idea of not drinking wasn't something that ever resonated with me, certainly not for 31 days since I was pregnant. So this was a whole new thing for me, and I'm excited to share what I learned from the book with you all. I am a huge note taker. Like, I've talked about this on Instagram before, but like I take lots of notes every time I read. And so if you see me referencing this paper, it's because I don't want to get anything wrong and because I took lots of notes. So let's jump right in. So I think what made this book so powerful for me was that she didn't just come out and say alcohol is bad. She didn't build her whole argument around this moral argument that this is a bad thing and therefore you shouldn't do it. What she actually did was build a well-researched kind of body of work around how the industry as a whole, how the system as a whole has linked alcohol to our liberation, to our freedoms, to our femininity, to all sorts of things. And like, that's actually the reason why we turn to alcohol so often. And I thought that was a really powerful approach because that made more sense to me than don't do this because you're bad. And so I had two big takeaways. One, because it made me think about my struggles with money. I remember when I started my debt-free journey, everything was just about how debt was bad, how spending was bad, how having fun was bad. And that didn't really resonate with me because I didn't want to feel like paying off my debt was going to be a punishment. And I felt the same way about not drinking. I didn't want it to feel like it was a punishment or deprivation. I wanted to feel like it was a choice that I was empowered to make and making because I had learned something new about it. So I'm gonna cover two big takeaways in this video. The first one is sort of what causes drinking, what causes a drinking problem. And then the second one is what happens when you realize you have a drinking problem, or if you identify as an alcoholic, or even if you just wanna change your relationship with alcohol, kind of what happens. So her first point around what causes a drinking problem, like I mentioned earlier, this is a well-researched book, and so there are lots of theories about what causes drinking problems and alcoholism, but she actually walks you through the kind of top 5, the most popular 5, and they are these. Trauma causes drinking problems. There's a theory that trauma and people, drink to cope with their trauma. There is a theory of choice, where people are just making a choice to drink. They're exercising their liberties and they choose to drink. There is the theory that alcoholism is a disease, that it's genetic, that it's inherited, or that it's somehow picked up and it's a sickness. There is that alcoholism and overdrinking is a result of capitalism and the systems that kind of run our economic system here in America. Drinking is a result of that. And then the last one is that drinking is adaptive, which is really just a fancy word for learned. And this is where she stands. She feels like it's a mix between kind of capitalism and adaptive, but she really leans into the adaptive nature of drinking, basically saying that it's a learned habit, and if it's learned, then it can also be unlearned. And this really hit hard for me because she talks about the socialization of it. And it's one of those things, like whenever a demographic, whether it's women or Black people or Asian Americans or Latinas, whenever a demographic is struggling with something all at the same time, it tends to get lumped under just being like genetically predisposed or just a general higher likelihood. And what she actually does is tap into the cultural expectations for the demographic that is most affected by alcohol, which is women. And she talks about how it's become this means of expressing ourselves, and how the industry, through media, through advertising, through movies and beauty images, all of this has connected alcohol to our liberation and to our feminism. And so women are socialized to think that anytime something good happens, we need a drink. Anytime something bad happens, we need a drink. If we're struggling with motherhood, we definitely need a drink. If we're struggling with our weight, well, let's have a drink. And so she goes through this, and I just thought it was a really powerful way to do it because she actually compares it to cigarettes. And she says what we're doing is we're not actually dealing with the emotion, we're not actually coping with the emotion, we're just numbing it. And we should really think of alcohol the same way we think about, Novocaine at the dentist, and that it's meant to be like a temporary numb, but it doesn't actually do the work of removing the cavity or whatever emotional burden that you're going through. Going through all of these examples of how media and Hollywood perpetuate the idea of drinking as a solution, it really makes me think about how we're also taught not to question it at all. Because it's so normal, we're taught just don't even question it. Like, that's just the way it is. And it made me think about the early chapters of our book, Cashing Out, where we're going through the same exercise looking at the data and the disparities of the Black professional experience in the workplace. We're saying that all of this stuff is happening, and then we're taught not to question it. We're taught to believe that it's normal to work twice as hard for half as much. We're taught that it's normal to look up at leadership and see nobody that looks like us. We're taught that it's normal that most white professionals have never reported to or received instruction from a Black colleague because of the way that org charts are set up. We're just taught that this is normal, and then we start to lose the idea that it's not. We start to lose the ability to use our voice to advocate for something different. So the last thing I'll say before I move to the second takeaway is that she basically says that our own relationship to drinking is usually defined by someone else's drinking, right? So it's easy to say that you don't have a problem as long as you can see someone who drinks more than you do or who struggles with alcohol more than you do. And then on the flip side, if you stop drinking or if you decide to drink less, then your friends and family start to feel some kind of way about their drinking based off of yours. And so we forget that drinking is often this qualifier for belonging and for connection. And she tells these stories about how when she first stopped drinking, she would go hang out with her friends, and they would always say something about her not drinking. And then one day she was out and she decided to smoke a joint with one of her homegirls. And her homegirl was just like so relieved, like, oh my God, you're still in there. And she was like, of course I'm still in there. But it made her realize just how isolated this journey could be if she didn't surround herself with like-minded people, because people always felt like her not drinking was some sort of judgment or indictment on their drinking. And the way that they related to her is if she was willing to have something that made them feel less guilty about what they were doing. So she says that in America, we actually measure our relationship with alcohol through the word alcoholism and alcoholic. And there's a cost to that. Because of all of the stigma and the negativity attached to those words, if we don't identify it, we'd never even challenge our relationship with alcohol, because we're only focusing on that extreme end. And we only think in black and white. If we're not like them, if we're not like the people who are blacking out and slurring, then we assume that we don't have a problem. If we're not at the extreme end, then we don't have a problem at all. But then she lists the statistic that says 90% of heavy drinkers, which heavy drinkers are defined as women who have 8 or more drinks in a single week, are not formally addicted. So 90% of heavy drinkers don't have a formal addiction. However, being a heavy drinker is actually what causes a lot of these health disparities and consequences of alcohol. And so I was surprised by this, because I thought 8 drinks was kind of low. That's exactly where I was. I would have a glass or 2 of wine 4 or 5 days a week with dinner or out with friends, and that actually qualifies me as a heavy drinker. And I'd never thought about it that way. I think I had thought about heavy drinkers as like binge drinking in one sitting versus looking at the frequency and the consistency in which you drink. And so that was a big aha moment for me, because she's right. I don't identify as an alcoholic, but I also didn't identify as a heavy drinker because I didn't know that definition existed. Okay, so her point is really that the language around alcoholism and alcoholics, and if you think about kind of what she means, the idea that they're one drink away, that it's an incurable disease, that they can't have one drop, that they can never touch alcohol again. There's all this mixed messages around what's considered normal, and that extreme definition of alcoholic and alcoholism is what prevents us from exploring the gray area. And I think the same is true for wealth. I think we tend to focus on the extreme ends before we call somebody rich, meaning they have to have like a $10 million net worth or a $100 million net worth, or they have to be a billionaire to be considered rich. And then the same is true for the other end of the spectrum, to be considered poor. Or even, we start to add these qualifiers like working poor, where you're still on the edge of financial stability, but you may not identify with a label. I know when I was struggling with credit card debt and had a negative net worth, I didn't consider myself to be financially unstable. I had a reliable job. I was getting paid every other week. I could make my rent payments, and I lived in a nice apartment. And so I didn't take the financial wake-up call that I needed, because I didn't identify with having a problem. I thought the way I was living was actually very normal, and I was okay with it. But Holly says that so much of our culture is waiting for people to hit rock bottom before we decide to do something. And she likens it to waiting until somebody has a heart attack before you check their cholesterol levels. Like, that just doesn't make any sense. You should be looking at these things along the way on a regular basis to make sure that you don't have any sort of leading indicators that rock bottom is coming. The other thing she talks about is just the questions that we ask ourselves. So if we're only trained to ask ourselves, am I an alcoholic? Then the answer is always going to be no, and there's really no reason or incentive to work on your drinking or to try to change the habit. And it reminded me a lot of how language in the personal finance community is very similar to this, like very black or white, am I this or am I that? Instead of asking more thoughtful, sort of generative questions around what you're trying to do. So in the case of like, am I an alcoholic? That might not be a great question to ask yourself, but you can ask yourself, does alcohol take more than it gives? Do I feel like I can accomplish, am I closer to my goals when I'm not drinking versus when I am? And those questions are actually gonna lead you to change your relationship. And that actually made me think about when I quit my job back in 2020, because at the time I was only asking myself, like, am I financially independent? And the answer was no. I didn't have 25 times my expenses in a portfolio somewhere. But I had enough money to make a decision. I had earned the right to ask myself different questions. When I started to ask myself more reasonable questions beyond just like, am I financially independent? I actually got the clarity that I needed to move forward with the decision that was ultimately best for me. So I started asking myself, what kind of person is this job teaching me to be? Could I be a better wife, daughter, mother, friend, person without spending the majority of my waking hours worried about this job? And when I started to explore those things, that's actually when I came to the conclusion that I would be okay if I left this job. And I know focusing on language feels like such a small thing, but it's really big, especially when you think about how people's decisions are shaped by language. So take retirement, right? Which is the R in financial independence, retire early. It's the R in FIRE. And this is really what gets the most beef from everybody, is the idea that we can retire earlier than we would even want to. And that's primarily because of the definition of retirement was created back in 1920 something. And it was created at a time where the average life expectancy wasn't even 65. So people didn't retire, they just died. They just, like, that's how they stopped working. And so again, going back to Holly's point, we were taught to never question it. We were never taught to question this idea that we should be working up until we're 65. And so now in the 2020s, when we see that that's not working, when there's a retirement crisis, and most Americans are not able to retire at 65, the idea that we would do something different about that is hard for people because there isn't a word to describe what the alternative is. So where does that leave me? Early in the book, Holly talks about how once you learn the truth about alcohol, you really can't unlearn it. And that's kind of where I am. I don't think I'll ever think about mindless drinking anymore, just the same way I don't think about like mindless spending, right? Like, it's hard for me to watch a scene where someone's making it rain or like doing something crazy with their money and not like counting the dollars. Like, damn, that's a lot of money. But at the same time, like, I don't embrace the word minimalist in my life. Like, although I'm very mindful about my spending, I don't consider myself a minimalist. And I don't plan on embracing the word sober. I don't plan to be sober. I don't identify as a sober person. And I personally have beef with just this idea of always wanting to label and compartmentalize things. And I just think we have this trend of people adopting language and talking about it and having conversations with a very surface level understanding of what that language may mean to the people who need it most. So I know that sober and sobriety is a huge part of a large population's identity around alcohol. And I want to respect that and say that, like, I know what that means for you. I know you don't need people like me coming in and being like, I am sober on Tuesdays and Tuesday through Friday, but I'm not on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, because that's just not how the word works for them. I liken it to, there's this word flexitarian, which is kind of an in-between of like, I am mostly vegan/vegetarian, but I allow myself to enjoy meat products every once in a while. It's this population of people who are trying to define their lifestyle where it's like, I'm mostly plant-based, but if you see me eating a chicken wing, don't come for me because I'm also flexitarian. So that's how I feel about what I am after this experience. I also don't want to stay abstract. So there is actually a word for kind of this gray area of drinking, and it's called sober curious. That is the label that I most identify with. If you Google it, you'll get a bunch of stories, you'll get a bunch of videos, a bunch of think pieces around how people are kind of adopting this lifestyle. And I really like it because it's more like an invitation to remain curious. I think that it would be pointless for me to define my long-term relationship with alcohol without first really understanding how I got here to begin with, how I created this relationship that I have with it now. And so calling myself or joining the sober curious movement is a reminder to me to just stay curious. When I want to have a drink to celebrate, I can ask myself, like, what feeling am I chasing and why do I think it's in the bottom of this glass kind of thing. I also like sober curious because it reminds me of this other term that my friend Diana created, which is FI curious, financial independence curious, for the people who discover the financial independence movement and they have a spark, right? They like what they see, but they're not quite ready to commit to saving 50% of their income and giving up some of the things that they love in their life right now. But it allows you to stay on the edge of the movement and still glean the parts that work best for you. So that's kind of where I am with that. The second thing that I'm doing after this experience is taking a holistic approach and not just focusing on alcohol. And I think that's because one of the reasons this time period was so transformative for me is because I got a lot of practice sitting with uncomfortable feelings. There were a lot of nights where I felt antsy and restless and bored and anxious and excited, and I wanted to have a drink to commemorate that emotion, to process that emotion, but I kept going back to the book and realizing that that's not actually feeling the emotion, that's numbing it if I have a drink. And so I got a lot of practice of like sitting with emotions and feeling them. And that has had compounding effects in my life. It has allowed me to use the same practices in other areas of my life and just become more mindful in general. Because one of the things you have to remember if you are removing a coping mechanism, whatever it is in your life, even if it's spending, it's very easy to replace it with another one if you don't actually get to the root of why you're doing it to begin with. And so keeping the process holistic, where you are not only tending to the habit itself, but you're also kind of fulfilling yourself through exercise, through meditation, through physical movement, and just all the healthy things that you can do. It helps you not replace the habit with something else that you don't want to be doing repeated. And then the third thing that I'm gonna do is be gentle with myself regardless. Regardless of what happens, I'm going to be gentle with myself. I think the chapter that I highlighted the most in the book was chapter 11, and it's called Get at the Root, Learning How to Mother Yourself. And it's basically about how we never really grow up. But socially, we have all of these thoughts about what age we're supposed to stop doing certain behaviors. And so what adulting is really just like all of us trying to maintain a facade whenever we do these things that we're supposed to have grown out of. And the chapter actually walks you through all of these modalities, some of which I just mentioned, that help you kind of cope with being different than social expectations. So basically, the chapter kind of walks you through all of these modalities, from yoga to meditation to stretching to therapy, all of these things that help you cope when you feel like you haven't met society's expectations of yourself or your own expectations of yourself, instead of just walking around with a facade, which then causes you to drink. She also talks about, the reason I like this chapter is because she goes into detail about the rebalancing that your body does after you get rid of a substance, or after you detox essentially. And she talks about some of the side effects that you may experience, like acne, restlessness, moodiness, body odor, painful periods, like all of these almost negative side effects of doing this good thing for yourself. And she talks about how it can be like a slap in the face a little bit. And by the time I got to this chapter in the book, I really felt her, because I thought everything was gonna be like significantly better across all areas once I got rid of this poisonous, air quotes, substance. And that wasn't the case. There were actually side effects. There was withdrawal, and there were some of these unpleasant side effects that I experienced. And she's reminding you in this chapter to be patient with yourself and to understand that that's part of the process. And again, it reminded me of debt payoff. A couple of people who may have paid off a credit card here or there know this, but like when you pay off your debt, your credit score often takes a dip, like it declines, and it feels like a slap in the face because you just did all this so that you could improve your credit score and live this life, and now like you see the dip. But again, you know, we always tell people like it's completely normal. It will rebalance. You just have to be patient and kind to yourself, and remember the bigger reasons why you did this. And so that is the same approach that I'm taking, and hopefully my body rebalances very soon, because I kind of miss old me to that extent. So yeah, I highly recommend this book. I went into it not realizing how similar the recovery space was to the personal finance space. And after finishing it, I'm realizing that they're absolutely intersectional, and I had never thought about it that way. I never thought about how money feeds into drinking, and how drinking feeds into money, and how it creates this loop. If you've read the book or done your own dry January experience, I would love to hear from you. Even if you are currently sober or sober curious, I would love to hear from you. Drop me a comment in the comment section below, or click the link in our description and visit us on any social page and hit me up there. If you like this review and want to learn more about what I'm reading every week, you can join our newsletter where I send lots of articles and interesting facts from things that I've read. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel where I hope to do more videos like this after I finish reading. Thanks for listening.